Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. I'm Rebecca Friedman, founding director of the Wolfsonian Public Humanities Lab at Florida International University in Miami. Welcome to today's installment of Season 3 Coffee and Conversations, discussing contemporary issues with Miami Book Fair. With the election still up in the air, legal battles being planned, and votes being counted, racism continues to rage and the coronavirus part of our everyday lives. Today's conversation seems particularly vital. So thank you all for being here and thank you for tuning in. As by now you know, we started the series Coffee and Conversations at the beginning of the coronavirus. And what we did is we talked to a whole host of directors of cultural institutions around the country and world, because it seemed to us that the power and responsibility of cultural institutions had never been more poignant. Then we turned to the long-standing pandemic of racism and anti-Blackness in this country in Season 2, Cultural Institutions and Histories of Anti-Blackness. Today, as we continue to engage in conversations about arts and culture, in this moment, we continue Season 3, a collaboration with Miami Book Fair. This collaboration involves several of the most well-known thinkers living and writing today, all of whom will be participating in the 37th Miami Book Fair between November 15 and 22nd, 2020. To top it off, today we have as our guest the one and only Peniel E. Joseph, author of newly released The Sword and Shield, The Revolutionary Lives of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. Dr. Joseph is a scholar, teacher, and leading public voice on race issues who holds currently a joint professorship at the LBJ School of Public Affairs and the History Department in the College of Liberal Arts at the University of Texas, Austin. Dr. Joseph joined UT Austin from Tufts University, where he founded the school's Center for the Study of Race and Democracy to promote engaged research and scholarship focused on the ways in which race and democracy impact the lives of global citizens. Needless to say, this work has never been more vital, although I would add it has always been. So thank you for all the work you've done and you're doing. Saying we're honored to have him is an understatement. And he's joined by our wonderful colleague, Elisa Silver, who is our newest public humanities hire at FIU, who is also associate professor in the Department of Architecture. We're so excited you're here too. So very briefly, our format's simple. Our two guests will talk for about 20 minutes, and then we will take questions from the audience for the remaining 10. So at any time, members of the audience can submit a question using the Q&A chat button at the bottom of the screen. So without any further ado, I will turn it over to Elisa. Thank you. Thanks both for being here.
Thank you, Rebecca, and thank you, Peniel. This is a really honor to be able to speak with you about your book, which I enjoyed very much, and just thank you so much for all that work and for putting it out there, especially just for those of you who might not be familiar with the book. It frames this contrast and complementary way of understanding the lives of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. In a way that I think is very fresh to the discourse that we might otherwise be familiar with, associated with the lives of these two incredible men. But so as it progresses, the chapters go back and forth between each person and how they kind of evolved in their trajectory from beginning with their youth. And I found it especially interesting how you framed their relationships with their fathers in a very kind of, I think, significant way to then understand their characters and their motivations in their lives later on. In the case of Malcolm, unfortunately losing his father in a very sad and tragic way, murdered by white supremacists, but then replaced by Elijah Muhammad, and all of that, what that meant. And on the other side, Martin Luther King's father was just a larger than life figure that he admired tremendously. So if you could just talk a little bit about that, I think it would be very interesting to.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you, Alyssa, and thank you, Rebecca, for the invitation. Malcolm is, it's a very fraught relationship. Malcolm always believes that his father was killed by white supremacists. parts of his family feel otherwise, and there's new information that says, well, his father did die in a streetcar accident, but the idea that his father was killed by white supremacists is important for him. And the family had been terrorized by the Klan in Oklahoma, in Nebraska, so they had situations with racial terror. So losing his father and then having his mother placed in a psychiatric institution when he's young and he's a foster child really impacts him. So both in East Lansing, Michigan, and then in Boston and then Harlem, he really becomes what we would call a juvenile delinquent in the parlance of the time. So he's somebody who's not involved in violent crimes, but certainly involved in the criminal underworld. He sells drugs. He's involved in all kinds of schemes that eventually end up with him being incarcerated. And really, he's incarcerated for almost 7 years between 1946 and 1952. Part of the reason why he gets an 11-year sentence is because he's part of an interracial um, burglary ring. His girlfriend is Armenian. The authorities don't like that in Boston. And he had been used to interracially dating going back to East Lansing. And it was frowned upon there, but it's interesting. It wasn't the death sentence that it would have been in the Deep South. And so he's always looking for a father figure, and he really finds one in jail with Richard Embry, who becomes a figure called Bimby in his autobiography, who really helps him understand how to use his mind. He's always very close to his older brother Wilfred and his older brother Filbert as well. And they introduce him to the Nation of Islam along with his sister Ella Mae Collins. And then in Elijah Muhammad, he finds this father figure for the next really 15 years. With King, King is the son of Sweet Auburn Avenue. He's the son of a Black upper middle class, a relative economic elite and professional elite. When you think about King is born in 1929, Malcolm's born in 1925. Probably the only profession a Black man can do with dignity in that context is being a preacher, right? Much more so than being a professor, much more so than being a business person, much more so than virtually any other profession. So his father is head of really one of the important churches, Ebenezer Baptist Church. His father had gone to Germany and changed both his name and his son's name from Michael King to Martin Luther King Sr. and Jr. Because of the theologian. So they're very much in the same historical milieu, but they're having different outcomes. Although one of the things I do early on is show how they're both influenced by Gone with the Wind. King is there when it premieres in Atlanta, and he's 10 years old, and his father and mother have told him how racist it is. So he's really appalled by the spectacle, the red carpet spectacle. Malcolm actually sees Gone with the Wind in Mason, Michigan, which is a sort of a suburb of East Lansing. And he's 14, and he remembers how just humiliating it was to watch that, because Gone with the Wind obviously is sort of a racist apologia for racial slavery, the antebellum South, this, sort of this idea of slavery as mint juleps and tea and the lost cause. And we're still facing, the Gone with the Windification of America today, but they both experienced that. So early on, they're both influenced by these strong Black male figures. And for King, it's not just his father, it's Benjamin Mays, the Morehouse president, Howard Thurman. King gets a lot of great Black role models who are doing the right thing within the context of racial capitalism, which is one of the reasons why, even though King personally is radical in his beliefs, he's really a reformer for much of his career. And in contrast, Malcolm, his radicalism really in certain ways comes from being outside of these structured normative systems. He's been incarcerated, at a time where, relative to mass incarceration now, um, um, that's a unique experience, even though Black people were still disproportionately represented in the criminal justice system. So Malcolm is not an institutionalist in the same way that King is.
Right, right, and even there's a part where you talk about how Malcolm Martin Luther King is a part of this sort of hierarchy, and he believes in that system because of his time in the seminar and with these different figures. He has a clear hierarchy of relationships, whereas Malcolm seems to come out of that sooner. Yeah. The other component that I think then ends up being pretty significant, as you explain it, is their time abroad, their travels. Malcolm X gets to go to the Middle East and North Africa and has an incredible experience there, even changes his attire. Just comes out of it with a broader mind. And he said, you frame it that way, that travel isn't so much a change, it's just you broaden your mind. And I thought that was revealing of how, this had been a key moment in his thinking. And then for Martin Luther King, his time in Ghana and India also really tremendously influential. And when I believe the memoir of Stride Towards Freedom comes out of that too. So those parallels and those experiences, as they produce subsequent reflections, you also kind of weave them together, which I found very interesting. If you could elaborate further on that.
Oh yeah, certainly. They're both anti-colonial activists.
Exactly.
They're both anti-imperial activists. It's just that Malcolm's anti-imperialism and anti-colonialism is going to be more robust in the first half of when you think about the 1950s, early 60s, and then King is really going to take that on by the late 1960s in bigger, bolder ways. But they're both anti-imperialists. I'd say Malcolm, he visits the Middle East for the first time in 1959. He spends 5 weeks there. He meets up with Vice President Anwar el-Sadat. He meets up with Prince Faisal, Saudi Arabia. He's in Cairo. He's really interested in global travel, and he from being there, he starts to think about this idea of a third world revolutionary Pan-African Muslim international that would be secular in scope. And when you think about Malcolm, he's also influenced by the Bandung Conference, the Afro-Asian Conference of 1955, where 29 representatives, 29 nations totaling over 1 billion people created the non-aligned movement, what we think about the third world, right? And so Malcolm's really thinking about utilizing anti-colonialism, not just abroad, but domestically. And we're thinking by 1959, the Cuban Revolution occurs. 1960, the United Nations says is the year of Africa. So he's really thinking about indigenous people's right to political self-determination globally. King visits Ghana, but again, King is an institutionalist in the sense of he's able to hang out with Vice President Richard Nixon. He's able to meet Kwame Nkrumah. Malcolm's able to meet Nkrumah too in Harlem, and then later in '64 in Ghana. But King very early on, at a very, very early age, in a way that nobody would be able to replicate now. You're not going to be 26, 27 years old, and the Black press is saying you're the man of the year. You're not going to be viewed as, even before he's Time Magazine's man of the year, you're not going to be able to go to India for a month and people are going to fet you like you're really a prime minister if you're unelected. You're an unelected preacher in the future, in this contemporary present. So King is really this extraordinary figure, but it's also the time. So he goes to India, spends a month in India. He visits where the untouchables are there. And that month is very important for him. And Jet Magazine and the Black press covers it because he starts to feel that part of his mission is not just anti-colonialism, but part of his mission is anti-imperialism that's going to rid the world of violence and hunger and segregation, in addition to racism, right? So they both are these global figures. I would say that Malcolm, by '64, when he spends 26 weeks abroad, and he's really does the Hajj pilgrimage, but he's also in Europe. He's in Paris, but he's all throughout Africa, goes to Cairo for the Organization of African Unity conference. He starts to argue that the civil rights movement has to be a human rights movement. Malcolm had access to an office at the United Nations. He meets up with Fidel Castro in 1960. King meets up with Ben Bella of Algeria, the president of Algeria in 1962. So they're both anti-imperialist, anti-colonialist, but Malcolm is really trying to do it from the outside in, and King's trying to do it from the inside out. So King, unlike Malcolm, has access to 3 different American presidents. He's going to be the youngest recipient of the Nobel Prize in history still. So King is this formidable figure, but certainly they both think of themselves as figures who are on the world stage. Malcolm is sort of this unelected prime minister, and King is this global statesman. But King's radicalism is going to come later than Malcolm's, but that's where they converge at that point of that intersection of radicalism and global human rights.
Yeah, that's a great way of framing also this other aspect of that international kind of exposure that I feel, and also it translates into national movements with socialism and social democracy, and how they both had a relationship with these ideas. So Malcolm X gets the endorsement of the Socialist Workers' Party and an interview, and he's in the militant. I didn't realize it, but it's a newspaper that still is even published today.
Yes.
And then he's the OAAU, the Organization of Afro-American Unity, gets a public endorsement from its candidate. And on the other side, Martin Luther King has always sort of been critical of capitalism. He reads Marx, he reads Gandhi. But then, as you just mentioned, he looks at it even more, I think, deeply after his trip to receive the Nobel Prize and his time in Scandinavia. He's just struck by how this is a nation without poverty, right? And is appalled then at looking at the United States and seeing that this is really a failure of political will internally. There's a great quote that you have in the book. And it ends it with saying what they're using to solve their problems in Africa and Asia is not capitalism, that he reminds his audience. So I just found that to be, I don't know, something also very pertinent to what we are considering and talking about today in our political context. So my thoughts are, how much of this was something that I think helped them get more support as this movement for Black citizenship, Black nationalism was building its discourse, but also genuine interest in these other kind of strategies. I think King at some point even says that he's so dismayed with colonialism as the worst moment of our history, and also being a practice that encouraged or required discrimination and racism in some terms.
Elisa, they are both very, very critical of capitalism over time, for different reasons. I argue that Malcolm is arguing for radical Black dignity, and King is arguing for radical Black citizenship. And so in that sense, over time, they come to converge and see that you need Black dignity and citizenship. Malcolm says that Black dignity is really the absence and eradication of world white supremacy. And so when we think about Malcolm X, where he diverges from King and where King is going to come along, and then where King diverges from him and where he's going to come along, is that Malcolm, he takes Black humanity as a given and is not arguing for Black humanity, for the humanity of Black folks to white folks. He's not interested. He takes it as a given. So Malcolm's entire rhetorical strategy is twofold. One, and I say that he's Black America's prosecuting attorney. So one, he's prosecuting whites for a series of crimes that go back to racial slavery, but that are contemporaneous. So he's constantly saying that. He's saying Black people are victims of American democracy. These are crimes. His famous analogy is you can't stick a knife in a person's back 9 inches and pull it out 6 inches and say that that's progress. And that's what he says. He says, you haven't taken the knife out, and America won't even acknowledge there's a wound there, right? Now, when we think about the second part of his strategy, is telling Black people that their liberation resides in the last place they ever care to look, which is within themselves, their own tradition, their own histories, both histories in the United States, but histories that predate the United States, which is why he's obsessed with Africa, and he's obsessed with African liberation, and he's obsessed with telling people who are calling themselves Negro and colored people that that is not who you are, right? That you are Black, that you're Afro-American. You can even call yourselves African, but you're not a Negro. That's just sort of this white person's invention. And from that rhetorical strategy, as he travels, social democracy and different forms of government that are not circumscribed by racial capitalism become he becomes very receptive to that, going to other countries. And then King, I argue, is talking about radical Black citizenship. And in this sense, King is saying not just the absence of oppression, but what does justice look like? And he's saying that it's voting rights, but it's also he calls it decent housing. It's also healthcare. It's also guaranteed income. King was talking about universal basic income before Andrew Yang was talking about a universal basic income, right? It's Martin Luther King Jr. and the Poor People's Campaign. So sometimes people think they're reinventing the wheel, but they're not, right? But King serves as a defense attorney in contrast to Malcolm. King defends Black lives to white people and to white America, and he then conversely defends white souls to Black people. So like when you think about this election, what King would say is that, yes, there's 68 million people who voted for this white supremacist, but there's 71 million people, or 72, 73 million people, including a bunch of white folks, millions of white folks who voted for the anti-racist candidate, right? And he'd want you to focus on that. Do you see what I'm saying? He'd want you to focus on that, where Malcolm would say, hey, look at all these people who voted for this white supremacist, and that's who the country is. Do you see what I'm saying? Yeah. And so over time, though, King starts to see, from traveling to Scandinavia, being advised by people like Bayard Rustin, being open to people like Ella Baker and others, that the system of US capitalism, especially after the Los Angeles Rebellion of 1965, is not equitable and fair enough to achieve citizenship, right? And so that's where he becomes very much more open to social democracy as a political strategy. He had always been open to it in terms of his own personal ideology, but King is somebody who's very disciplined and could separate what he feels personally from what he thinks is possible politically. But starting in 1965, which coincides with Malcolm's assassination, you start to see, after the passage of the Voting Rights Act, King evolves into another person. And in a lot of ways, he starts to echo Malcolm X's political radicalism. And he owes a lot of that framework. Malcolm had spoken out against the Vietnam War. Malcolm had spoken out against Johnson's Great Society. Malcolm had said that American democracy was nothing but American hypocrisy. He starts to speak in that same language, which is really remarkable. So when you think about King in 66, 67, 68, when he's saying that the United States is the greatest purveyor of violence in the world, he's in Marks, Mississippi with poor Black folks, and he's in tears when he hears them talking about having no shoes, no clothes, no food, right? And we live in a country, 37 million Americans every day don't know where they're going to get their next meal. King is in tears, but what's so instructive for us, the language he uses, he says that the way you're living in Marks, Mississippi is a crime, right? Malcolm had always couched racism and racial discrimination as a crime against humanity, against Black people. King starts to use the same language. And then Malcolm had always talked about racial slavery with the house Negro versus field Negro analogy. And King starts to say by 67, 68, that this country provided land for European immigrants and for white Americans, through the Homestead Act, but didn't provide African Americans, Black folks, with the 40 acres and a mule. And he says that this is the same group of people who are telling you to pull yourselves up by your bootstraps, right? So what's so interesting about King, who he becomes, he starts to talk about Black dignity and citizenship in his own lifetime in ways that are really profound and profoundly radical and profoundly unsettling. So he continues to talk about nonviolence, but he argues that nonviolence should be used as a political sword, not just as a political shield. And that's what Malcolm X had argued about the March on Washington. Malcolm had called the March on Washington a farce on Washington because he wanted it to paralyze the entire city. And when it didn't do that, he was upset. By 65, King says, we're going to start paralyzing cities, because King, after Watts, is extremely disappointed in LBJ, the Great Society, all of it. And part of it is because we're spending so much money in Vietnam, but he starts to criticize this idea of militarism, racism, and materialism, right? And so he sees that embedded in our city, in our system, is just a value gap, both a value gap between whites and Blacks, but also a value gap between humanity and money, right? And so he starts to push back against that in really profound ways that make him this extraordinarily radical and then revolutionary figure. So everyone's right when they say King was always this apostle of nonviolence, but they're not right when you say somehow he's a teddy bear and not this this big time revolutionary who is demanding new things of all of us. He's demanding a guaranteed income, and he's demanding that we refuse to allow a society where people go hungry and are homeless and don't have decent housing. And he's saying he's going to occupy Washington, D.C. non-violently until this happens, and he's assassinated before he gets to Washington, D.C. So we have to understand why King was considered such a dangerous figure in that sense.
I want to intervene, can I? I'm dying to ask a question, even though it's not my turn. I mean, and I'm trying to figure out how to formulate this. So interesting. Can you kind of tell us and our audience why it is that MLK is such a darling of America, right? Like why my children have learned all about MLK, and, you know, and then if Malcolm X comes into the history books at all for school children, he really is this like radical, revolutionary, you know, etc. You know the deal. Yeah. So can you I know you've kind of answered that in very complex ways just now, but if you can kind of say that in a, I don't know, easy way so that I can somehow carry that on to my kids and explain, because I'm always trying to explain, no, King was actually much more radical than what you're being fed in school.
But yeah, and the epilogue gets into that. So basically it didn't start out that way. By 68, even in the aftermath of King's assassination, although 125 million Americans watched the funeral, there's plenty of white Americans who are cheering in parts of the country when he's assassinated, okay? And so what you see is in the 15-year run-up between 68 and 83 and the King holiday, there's a real battle where Black folks, including King's widow, Coretta Scott King, and others, are trying to get King memorialized, right? There's real pushback, but eventually the compromise is going to be that King gets a holiday signed into law by Ronald Reagan, one of the most racist presidents in American history. But the pushback is that the compromise is this, and this is what you can explain to your kids. They're going to celebrate King as long as they turn him into some kind of petrified saint that becomes an example of American exceptionalism and racial progress. And so they're only willing to talk about his narrative within the confines of that agreement, right? And so once you get past the Voting Rights Act, he doesn't fit that narrative anymore. And the only way they were willing to have a holiday is to say, look, we're going to have a holiday because this person is this positive reflection of us. And we don't have to talk about the underside of American democracy, or what James Baldwin called, the big lie of racial slavery and Black dehumanization, right? And then Malcolm, in contrast, we are scared of Malcolm X because we've just we just say he's all about violence
Yeah.
and that he hated white people.
Yeah.
Neither one of which is true, but that's how he's framed. The only reason we still know of Malcolm today is because a group of Black people and then white folks like the Socialist Workers Party did great stuff in terms of spreading by any means necessary in his speeches around, and in the Spike Lee film, of course, and hip hop really got us, but then Malcolm, they've tried to sort of mainstream Malcolm. He's gotten a postage stamp.
Yep.
And conservatives have appropriated Malcolm as somebody who's sort of a pull yourself up by your bootstrap guy, and he would have voted Republican. He would have been none of which is true, but I'm saying that's how you try to frame him.
But even the MLK, the way in which, Martin Luther King is sold or packaged, if you will, doesn't actually reflect, it's not just, am I right that it doesn't actually reflect his ideas kind of ever, which is to say, because often people say, well, he was radical later in life, but in fact, if you
no, he's always a radical, but he's just politically, he's interested in reform because he thinks that's what's possible in that historical time period.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate that. Sorry, I know you had one more. If you want to ask your last.
No, I think we're actually up on top of the time. So yeah.
Okay, I apologize.
No, it was great. Pena, it was fantastic. It was really just a pleasure to talk with you, and especially thank you for writing this book.
Oh, no, thank you. I think both of them would have a lot to say about the time period that we're in now.
Yeah.
But both of the ideas of Black dignity and citizenship have been animating the contemporary Black Lives Matter movement. And really at least are animating at least a little bit more than half of the American electorate, which I think is really actually positive and hopeful, even though I understand why people are disappointed that the Biden ticket didn't get 100 million votes, but it's still more than half. And I think that tells us a lot about some hope for the future.
I'm going to take those words to heart. Thank you very much.
Yes.
Thank you very much for joining us today. And thank you to the audience for listening. And on Tuesday, next Tuesday, the 10th of November, we're going to be joined by poet John Murillo, author of Contemporary American Poetry, who will be in conversation with Ana Menendez, another public humanities faculty member who's an English professor and a creative writer in her own right. So please mark your calendar and join us when Walter Mosley, Ilsa Calderon, Bill Nye the Science Guy, Abby Wambach, Joy Harago, Natalie Portman, Richard Ford, and many other thought leaders share their work at the 37th Miami Book Fair 2020, November 15th to the 22nd. All readings, presentations, and conversations at the book fair will be free, so please visit online at miamibookfaironline.com. Thank you all so much for being here, and thank you so much, Dr. Joseph, for joining us. It was an incredible pleasure, and I look forward to whatever's next.
Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you, Alyssa.
Thank you.
You guys stay safe. Bye.
That was great. Thank you.
Thank you.